Hey everybody, welcome to another episode of The Bitter Pill. I'm not sure which episode this is, 27, 28, something like that. But anyway, the title of this video is 10 Things That Matter More Than Whether Biden or Trump is Elected. It might actually be 13 things that I have here, so sue me for counting wrong. But, everybody says 10 this or 10 that, so that's how I titled it. But we've been hearing an awful lot about the presidential election lately, and just like it always does every 4 years, it kind of drowns out discussion of specific political issues. Once the candidates get nominated and the general election starts getting close. So we haven't heard much in the news lately, for example, about the movement to defund or abolish the police, and Black Lives Matter movement, or really even, well, I guess there's still some news about coronavirus. A couple of universities have had to close because they opened back up and didn't take proper precautions and had a lot of cases. But that's a story for another video. Okay, so the way I've heard people talk on Facebook lately, which I kind of try to avoid going on Facebook partly because of this, is that who gets elected in November is like the most important event or outcome of the year and or of the century or whatever, and I think that's just silly because there are a number of things that this point of view presumes that are demonstrably false. For example, this notion that, as one of my Facebook friends put it a few months ago, Biden is 10,000 times better than Trump, and if we elect Trump again, we're going to have fascism and all this kind of stuff, or somehow Biden's going to save the planet from climate change, and of course Trump won't. But anyway, I can get into specific differences, or in my opinion, more importantly, similarities between Biden and Trump in another video. But so let me just get right to it here, after having spent a couple of minutes talking about other things. But anyway, one thing that's more important than whether the lesser evil, quote unquote, whoever you think that is, Biden or Trump in this case, is elected, is, in my view, whether or not vast numbers of people, large numbers of people, become more informed about the evils of both politicians like Biden and Trump, lesser or greater evils or whatever you want to call them, and their parties. Because when I look around social media, I see a lot of people who are just not very well informed politically, but damn, do they have strong opinions. And at least on my friends list, or list of people that I follow, an awful lot of them are a lot less informed about the problems with the Democratic Party, how they're constantly cheerleading for war, how most of them, just like the Republicans, are sold out to corporations and so on and so forth. So in order to make this happen, we need to quit obsessing so much about this horse race between Biden and Trump, or whatever the next one is in 4 years, and focus our attention on the issues. And rather than harping on and exaggerating the differences between candidates of the two parties or the parties themselves, we need to focus on what the similarities are between them. And again, we'll get into that in more detail in another video, but certainly things like being sold out to Wall Street, not caring much about the environment. Even if you believe in climate change, that doesn't mean you're going to do anything about it. And Obama, Biden certainly didn't do much about it. Overthrowing elected governments in other countries, bombing people in other countries. Both parties do all sorts of things. Not giving us guaranteed affordable health care, etc. So speaking of which, another thing that I think would be a vastly more important development in terms of making people's lives better than Biden getting elected rather than Trump, or some people think the other way around, is whether a movement for single-payer healthcare, Medicare for all, as it's often called here in the United States, becomes strong enough that some specific states, a big one like California, passes a statewide single-payer plan. If you know anything about the history of the implementation of Medicare in Canada, their single-payer healthcare system, it came about through the development of a strong movement, backing from labor unions and backing from a third party called the Cooperative Commonwealth Federation in the province of Saskatchewan. And it was implemented in Saskatchewan first before it spread to the rest of the country. And of course, here in the United States, the same thing is happening with marijuana legalization. It happened with gay marriage. That's often how change happens, because although we all know that, well, not all of us, but many of us know that corruption exists and is rampant on at all levels of government. It's much worse at the federal level than at the state level, than at the local level. You have more chance of getting things done, at least getting them done sooner. By things, I mean major reforms at a state or local level than you don't do at a national level. But in any case, if we got guaranteed universal health care where, my cousin told me when, he and his wife had a baby in Canada, he's Canadian, they got everything taken care of that they needed in the hospital. They could stay as long as they needed to. They got wonderful care, and they never got a bill. The government paid for everything out of the taxes that everybody pays. And that's the way it should be. We shouldn't have to worry about whether we're going to get socked with a medical bill that's going to bankrupt us if we have coronavirus. And having a reform like Medicare for all that alleviated that worry and gave us all great health care would matter more than Biden being elected than Trump, because unless you haven't been paying attention, that Biden and Trump both strongly oppose Medicare for all. Another thing that would matter more than one or the other of these two shitty corporate-owned candidates getting elected president would be whether or not a strong anti-war movement develops, or if it does, that will matter more. Because if you look at the history of both major parties throughout their history, really, they have pushed war after war after war after war, both of them. In fact, I think the last time I checked, the United States had started more wars when Democrats were president than Republicans were president. And I don't think it's that Democrats are more pro-war. It's just kind of a historical accident. But that and other aspects of our foreign policy, such as we're constantly implementing sanctions on countries that try to develop and pursue policies independent of the United States, like Venezuela or Syria or whoever. And we overthrow a lot of governments. That happens, again, under both Democratic and Republican presidents, elected democratic governments that are trying to help their people. That practice of getting the CIA or employing some goon squad in another country to try and overthrow their government, that goes way, way back. So most recently, a famous example was the effort which succeeded to overthrow the government of Bolivia. And I guess we don't yet have evidence that the U.S. had a direct hand in that coup, but they certainly supported it. Certainly the media propaganda helped that coup came about here in the United States. And this is a fascist government. And that's what you find with a lot of these coups that the U.S. either succeeds with, or they back it and it succeeds, or they try to, they attempt it, such as the many efforts that have been made to overthrow the government of Venezuela, the elected government of Venezuela, in elections that are far fairer than the elections here in the United States, which are rigged as hell. The U.S. has been trying to do that for 20 years, and they're backing racist, fascist elites, wealthy people in Venezuela who want to overthrow a government that represents indigenous people, brown people, people of color in Venezuela. Anyway, another thing that would be more important, that would matter more than whether Biden or Trump is elected, is whether a sustained general strike occurred in the United States. You may be aware that we owe many of the labor reforms, some of which we've had in this country, some of which still exist, some of which have been watered down, owe their existence to the labor movement of the 1930s, where there were, for example, sit-down strikes in factories throughout the industrial Midwest that forced companies to recognize labor unions, that forced Roosevelt to implement a living wage and Social Security and various other worker-friendly reforms, the 40-hour work week, etc. We can also use a similar sort of direct action, such as the Yellow Vest movement in France. We'll see what happens with that, but that's how you change things: is you get out in the streets and you protest and you shut things down and demand change. Relatedly, if, for example, the membership of labor unions in this country, which is at the lowest point it's been since before the 1930s, it's I think in the mid-single digits in the private sector now, a little bit higher in the public sector. It's very low compared to other industrialized countries. If, for example, we doubled or tripled the number of people who belonged to labor unions in this country, that also would make a bigger difference than whether Biden or Trump was elected. Of course, one thing notable about this election is that it's between two accused sexual predators. Both Biden and Trump have been accused by multiple women of some sort of sexual misconduct, either rape or assault or groping, or, well, I guess assault and groping are the same thing unless it's rape, harassment, many, many allegations against both of them. So in order to nominate someone like that as your presidential nominee, and incidentally, in the case of the Democratic Party, also to have accused sexual predators like Bill Clinton and former Republican who still thinks like a Republican, Michael Bloomberg, have those people speaking at your convention, as well as nominating a accused rapist as your presidential nominee, and just sweep it under the rug, not talk about what women are saying about his conduct. I mean, it's sheer hypocrisy if you do that and say that you support Me Too. So, another thing that I think would really make a bigger difference than whether or not Biden or Trump is elected is whether the Me Too movement is rekindled through large numbers of people becoming insistent that men should be held accountable for sexual misconduct, regardless of which political party they belong to or how powerful they are. Joe Biden and Donald Trump should not be able to get away with this shit because they're running for the fucking president of the United States. That's absurd. It's a slap in the face to every woman who has been sexually abused. True women's rights advocacy is not hypocritical. And incidentally, it doesn't support coups in countries like Honduras, where basically a fascist regime took over in a military coup. This occurred during the Obama-Biden administration, that it was backed by the United States, and there was even a U.S. Military airplane that whisked the legitimate president of Honduras at the time, Manuel Zelaya, out of the country. And then the military took over there. They really are hostile to women there, the government of Honduras. So yet another instance of the Democratic Party being hypocritical about women's rights. Okay, another thing that would matter more than whether Biden or Trump is elected is whether the coal industry continued to die out, and the fact that it's declining to such a great extent because it's just not economically viable anymore, and there's so much opposition to this dirty form of energy that it's gradually, although not slowly, disappearing. Trump tried and failed to prop up the coal industry. I don't know whether Clinton would have if she'd been elected. So, we'll never know. But there's really nothing the federal government can do to keep it going because it's just too unprofitable. But I wondered, and somebody tell me if they know, do either of these two candidates have any real plan to support workers in the coal industry and their families who are being directly affected by the coal industry's collapse? So we have very high rates of poverty in centers of the coal industry like West Virginia. If they have, I haven't heard about it. Another thing that's making a bigger difference in the world, and will continue to make a bigger difference in the world than whether a corporate-controlled, warmongering, rapey Democrat is elected president, demented or close to it as well, versus an equally corporate-owned, warmongering, terrible person like Donald Trump is elected, is whether rapid advancements in alternative energy technology continue to occur. China is taking a leading role in the world in moving toward renewable energy and away from fossil fuels, and they've got a long way to go. But a business partner, Mark, has lives in Hong Kong and has traveled extensively in and lived in mainland China, and says their public transit is just fabulous, and they've got solar panels everywhere, high-speed rail. Most of the cars in cities in China these days are electric, so they're moving in that direction. Other countries are starting to as well, and ultimately, we're talking about what we have to do to save our planet. And, yes, the policy of the federal government in the United States is important, but it's not really the decisive factor. Changes are taken due to economic reasons and policies of state and local governments, regardless of what the federal government does. And frankly, Obama and Biden didn't do too much to promote alternative energy, and they heavily promoted the fossil fuel industry. And the U.S. became the leading fracker and the leading producer of oil and natural gas in the world during the Obama-Biden administration. A lot of people don't realize that, but it's true. So I don't expect that that will change if Biden is elected, because he's still getting the big bucks from the fossil fuel industry. Relatedly, it would make a bigger difference in the world if more people ate a plant-based diet than is currently the case. If a lot more people did, for all sorts of reasons, animals are suffering horribly as a result of humans' exploitation of them. Our health is adversely affected in a major way by the amount of meat and other animal products that we consumed. And the animal agriculture is the second leading contributor behind the fossil fuel industry to climate change, and really the leading contributor to environmental problems overall. So we really need to get that under control, and it would make a bigger difference than whether Tweedledum or Tweedledee is elected to president. Continuation and growth of the movement to defund the police or abolish policing as we currently understand it would make an enormous difference in this country. This is almost the only country in the world that has this absurd level of police violence that we have, disproportionately directed against people of color, but lots of white people are also brutalized by the police, as people who went out and protested this summer found out. And mass incarceration, which Joe Biden is a major architect of, is certainly a target of this movement. And if we abolish this policy of locking people up for every little thing and keeping them in jail forever, taking away their right to vote in a lot of cases, that would make a huge difference in this country, bigger than it would if we got one or the other of these two clowns, like whoever the least evil of these two clowns is elected. And as far as electoral politics goes, really, I think it makes a bigger difference if a progressive politician gets elected to Congress. So AOC beating sort of the centrist Democrat Joe Crowley a couple of years ago, even though there are things I don't like about AOC's politics. I think that's still a more positive development than a right-winger beating a far right-winger for president. If Shahid Buttar beat Nancy Pelosi, another right-wing Democrat, I think that would make a big difference. If Jen Perelman had been able to overcome the massive cheating, it looks like, in southern Florida during her congressional race against Debbie Wasserman Schultz, who's notorious for rigging elections. If Jen Perelman had been able to win, that would have made a big difference. And continuing in the electoral vein, major reforms of our electoral system, such as ranked choice voting, abolishing the Electoral College, making D.C. a state with representation in Congress, which actually this is one issue where the Democrats and Republicans do truly differ. I don't know where Joe Biden stands on it. He may say he's for it and not really be for it, but most Democrats are for making D.C. a state, which would give them representation instead of taxation without representation. Puerto Rico, similarly, if their citizens want it. reforming the voting system so we have hand-counted paper ballots or machines with open source software and an auditable paper trail, which is something that Tulsi Gabbard has advocated in a bill that she put before Congress last year, as well as a couple of years before that. Same-day voter registration, which increasing number of politicians are supporting. Reforms like that, particularly ranked choice voting, but others as well, because I guess it doesn't actually matter if we have ranked choice voting if they can still rig the outcome of the elections. We have one of the most unfair rigged electoral systems in the world. So this is a really big deal. I've talked about this before, that we would not ever have had President Bush or President Trump without massive voter suppression. We would have had Bernie Sanders being the Democratic nominee, most likely, in 2016 as well as 2020, were it not for the rigging that occurred against him. Not that there weren't other issues with the primaries, but that was a big one. Historically, there are many things that have mattered more than whether a Republican, even a far-right Republican like Trump or Reagan or the Bushes. George Bush Sr. is a lot more right-wing than most people realized. Historical things that matter more than whether people like that or Democrats were elected president are just any victory of a social movement that you can point to that, in large part, isn't a result of electoral politics. Did women get the right to vote by voting for it? No, they had a mass movement in the streets. Same with the abolition of slavery. Voting played a role there, but obviously slaves couldn't vote, and most black people couldn't vote. The ones that did, guess what? Most of them did. They abstained from voting in presidential elections because both of the candidates in elections in the mid-1800s were slave owners and or supporters of slavery. But some of them also supported third-party candidates like James Birney of the Liberty Party. But in any case, you can go through the list of major changes in this country. Every single one of them have been due more to action outside the ballot box, outside of the voting booth, outside of the electoral system than within it. More things change to a greater extent with direct action than with voting, which is not to say that voting can't matter, but it definitely matters than whether Tweedledum or Tweedledee are elected, even if there are real differences between Tweedledum and Tweedledee, as I guess you could argue that was the case with Roosevelt versus Hoover, or Johnson versus Goldwater, and so forth, and others. But direct action matters more. But going back to electoral politics for a moment, but not necessarily just electoral politics, developing a viable third party that represents the interests of workers and the oppressed, and not the bosses, like both the Democratic and Republican parties do, would make a bigger difference than voting in Joe Biden rather than Donald Trump. As evidence of that, I would point out to you just that the Republican Party was originally a third party. It rose up from kind of a fusion of anti-slavery activists and northern industrialists who didn't support slavery, but for business reasons, really. It was preceded by other minor third parties. I mentioned in Canada there were third parties that played a crucial role in implementation of single-payer healthcare. Same in the UK. And I mentioned these two specific countries because they're both countries that have electoral systems that very much discriminate against third parties, as does the system in the United States. And yet they had successful third parties develop in both of those countries. And in both cases, they played a key role in implementing major societal changes, such as national health care, the NHS in Britain or Medicare in Canada. So you bear these things in mind, and when you go to vote, I mean, if you live in a state like Indiana, where I live, or California, or someplace like that, I recognize that even if you actually believe that Biden is significantly better than Trump or whatever, you're not going to be able to help them win in those states because Indiana always goes Republican in any close presidential election. The only time it goes Democratic is in a Democratic landslide. It's happened 4 times in over 100 years. Similarly, in modern history, California just does not go Republican. Especially as more and more people of color and immigrants have come there. It's become more and more heavily Democratic, which unfortunately doesn't mean that they get all sorts of progressive legislation, because most Democrats are sold out corporatists, even in California. But in any case, certainly, you could say, okay, well, Biden would take the healthcare crisis more, the coronavirus crisis more seriously than Trump. Although certainly you can point to many examples of politicians from both parties who've really screwed up with the response to coronavirus. But okay, Biden might have done better than Trump did, because Trump did absolutely awful in responding to it, awfully. And maybe you could come up with some other differences, but look at the similarities between corporate-owned, military-industrial complex-owned candidates, which are the only kind of candidates you're going to get at the top of the ticket. And you recognize, there's other things we need to talk about and think about and do something about besides who we're going to vote for president. That's not the most important thing. Okay. That's all for this episode of The Bitter Pill. Please like and subscribe and comment on the video and tell me what you think. And if you feel so inclined, chip in a buck or whatever on our Patreon account. And I will see you next time.